All right, Deborah, we're recording, so go ahead.
Thank you. Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our session today. We will be discussing the coach's role in JEDI conversations with clients. I don't know about you, but every time I think about the word JEDI, I get the sense about Star Wars. If you're a fan, I'm a big fan of Star Wars, by the way. But today, the JEDI context is very different from the JEDI in Star Wars. So it's really an interesting perspective that we are going to be taking. So my name is Deborah George-Feres, and I am faculty member of the evidence-based program here at Fielding University. And I'm also an executive and leadership coach, and I hold a degree in leadership and organizational change. So I would love to introduce my esteemed panel members who are also my colleagues. You have Dr. Carrie Arnold, who is the program director for the evidence-based program at Fielding. She is a master certified coach with a PhD in human development. Along with being a member of the university, she runs her own coaching practice and works with clients primarily in government, healthcare, and education. So she describes herself as a positive, empathetic, curious, and creative woman. Wow. And so her purpose in life is to always grow and facilitate growth in others. She does this by providing a safe space in her role as a coach and educator. Now you also have my other colleague who is Deeper. And Deeper is an executive coach with a passion for creating transformational learning opportunities for her clients and students. She works with a diverse group of leaders who aspire to discover their best selves. As a faculty for Fielding University's evidence-based coaching program, Deeper mentors students and facilitates the learning of coaching skills. Deeper holds a degree in a PhD and also in organizational behavior and industrial psychology from the Stern School of Business, New York University. She is a Newfield ontological coach and certified as a somatic coach. In addition, she is also credentialed as an MCC with ICF. So you are in for a treat today. So get ready to engage in this really great dialogue because you're with some of the best minds in the coaching industry who has worked in on and also on many of these issues. I also want to extend a warm welcome to you, our live audience, and those who would be listening to this recording after this. So before we get started, there's just a quick ground rules I'd like to cover. The session, as you know, is being recorded and will be made available to you as a registered participant after the conference. And then I believe, if I'm not wrong, Carrie, the session should be eligible for CCEUs, I think. Okay. And I believe attendance is being tracked as well. So in terms of that, please ensure that you are muted. And due to security concerns, all attendants are muted upon entering. But if you're not for some reason muted, please ensure to do that. Also, we ask that you as the audience just keep your videos off during the session just to help support internet stability. That is really important in terms of hosting such a big event like this. And so for questions and answers, which we will, just questions, I hope, not answers, we will be utilizing the chat function. And what I ask is that when you ask a question and you post it in chat, please post it to everyone. That way that I will be sure to see it. Okay, now we have stated the ground rules, so let's get started. I am so excited about this topic, and I am so looking forward to engaging my colleagues in such an important discussion. So as you know, coaching is a multidisciplinary field, which is vividly reflected in the diversity of coaches and clients. Coaches come from a range of professional and cultural backgrounds. And I think because of that, there is a wide ranging perspectives and practices and philosophies of coaching. Because of these varied backgrounds, there is this thought the other side that this has made the coaching field very fragmented and have made it to even more difficult to really get to a unified framework. And so, although this diversity and this fragmentation to some has hindered the advancement of theoretical practices and cultural practices, I think this diversity is not inherently negative. I think that variations of practices do provide practitioners with a mix of approaches and as well as help them to customize to their clients' needs. So at the same time, I think that it helps to reveal the complexities of coaching in a globalized era. And coaching within a global context means that there is a clear need to understand culture and successfully apply cross-cultural strategies. So in this new era of globalization, coaches we know are working from and with a variety of clients. And so this is inherent in it is culture and the differences that there are that exist within that cultural context. So a solid understanding is actually needed, irrespective of what practices a coach may possess, that a coach must really understand the client's culture, whatever, how they define their culture, religion, life experiences, and the list goes on and on. And so I think that now we're at a crucial point in this very age where race and differences in general, in terms of coaching approaches and theories and strategies, will continue to be infused with different targets and practices that address those cultural contexts. So there is some feeling that the coaching profession has been silent on the issues of diversity. And so the question is, why is that? Why do some coaches feel like we have not taken an anti-racist stand, particularly with all of the recent events that have come forward? So some of us believe that neutrality is not that some stance that we should take, and that neutrality, there is a danger to that. And so if coaches are neutral, they may be complicit in the very things that we're trying to eradicate. So with that being said, I believe this conversation today about a coach's role in JEDI conversation is substantial, and the notes that we are holding ourselves responsible for championing the cause by furthering the dialogue and promoting action. So Carrie and Deepa, and you guys feel free to go first. My question today is that some use JEDI as an acronym and others say DE&IJ. Do you see a difference between the two?
I just realized I had session host as my name, so I just changed it to Carrie Arnold. I'm Carrie. I do see a really big difference between saying, you know, you're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice, with justice being the last thing, versus saying, my focus is on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think the justice as the front end and inclusion as the back end are really important bookends. I think a lot of conversations up till now have been focused on diversity and equity as initiatives, as policies. But maybe those approaches haven't quite given us the right space to have justice conversations or provided inclusion. And so for me, having JEDI, with justice being the very first word, creates a larger container for these conversations. Without justice, none of the other words can even emerge. So that's my perspective. And Deepa, I'd love to hear what you think. And Deepa, you're muted, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. And it's nice to meet everyone. Thank you, Carrie. Yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. Unless justice and equity they really create a context for making inclusion and diversity sustainable or even functional. What comes to mind is I came to this country as an immigrant, and I joined a large multinational corporation after I finished my education, and in the management development, with the management development group. And it was, all hunky-dory because I had a boss who really understood how to create a context of justice, how to give me the stools to stand on that I needed in order to be included. Just saying you're included was not enough, because there were differences in the exposure, there were differences in language, there were differences in color. I mean, just multiple differences in background. So unless I had those stepping stools, which he quite understood as creating the equity that was needed, I could not have had the same opportunities in the organization. And I think another thing that comes to mind is the power dynamics, the relationships. Unless I, as a subordinate or somebody who is not homogeneous with the rest of the group, unless there is a dynamic in the organization that empowers me to speak, and the dynamics is configured in a way that there is no threat to my speaking up, I will not speak. Mm-hmm. So I just want to exemplify what Kerry has said, that unless those things are in place, inclusion and diversity mean nothing.
Well stated.
Yeah, and what I would add is, as a coach, I'm a white woman. And so how I approach these conversations may look different than those other coaches who may identify as a coach of color. But for me, as a white woman, I do present myself as a coach who's very interested in JEDI conversations. A client's going to lean forward and say, tell me what you mean by JEDI. And what an invitation to say, here are the things that are very important to me in my practice at any time. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you're incorporating this into your leadership, in your organization, with your colleagues, in your career, whatever space your client is playing in. I think it's really important for us as coaches, though, we can only take our clients as far as we've gone ourselves. We have to do our own work, and how we present our own work can be part of our bio. It can be part of our chemistry calls. It probably needs to be a conversation that coaches are more committed to having up front, versus hoping eventually in the client engagement, there'll be an opportunity to coach around an issue. I would argue perhaps we need to be more vocal on our interest in being part of this work with our clients.
Completely agree with you, completely, again. And one of the mechanisms for doing this is to ask those questions very early on, actually during the intake stage, to be curious about the background. And this is not even a question of diversity here. Even if our clients are from the similar backgrounds, there are a variety of experiences that make them different. So often I ask my clients to do what I call a cultural bio, just a short one, very short, a few lines, where they state some of the unique features that distinguish their cultural experiences and their growth as an individual. So I think an attention to what our clients are bringing by way of narratives, by way of assumptions, beliefs, socioeconomic backgrounds, spiritual backgrounds. All of this is really, one has to be very curious about it as a coach.
And that really brings us nicely into the second question. You talked about just initiating the conversation by introducing a cultural bio. So what are some of the other things that coaches can do to initiate JEDI issues with their white clients so that they are paying attention to social justice in their leadership and still allow the client to determine the objective?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think that's when, when we're really practicing the coaching mindset and we're showing fidelity to those core competencies around letting the client drive the agenda, letting the client, decide where they want to go in their work. I think it goes back to what I said earlier, like you're sitting with this sensation that I want to ask about social justice issues or what's unjust in the situation, and yet would that take them in a different direction? And so we wrestle, and then we struggle to figure out, how do I as a coach work in that space if my client doesn't bring those objectives in? And I think I want to repeat what I said earlier. We as coaches have to frame it up front, that this is a place in my practice that's really important to me. And I want to invite you, client, in to explore some of this in our work together. I want to understand your sense of justice and injustice. I want to understand how your leadership is providing space for your own growth and development around some of these challenges that society is facing. How are you creating space for those you influence and lead? How we frame all of this in chemistry calls, in our coaching objectives, or I'm sorry, in our coaching agreement. Even if we're doing perhaps a coaching session so they can experience us, they should know up front. Carrie Arnold believes that this is really important, and I'm not going to be surprised if she begins to ask me JEDI questions because I have framed it up front. And if they're not comfortable doing that work, then they might not select me, and that's okay too. But I frame it. This is who I am. It's even in my signature line. I have a link to the work I've done around silencing. It should never surprise my clients when I bring up JEDI questions or JEDI assessments or hunches, because of how I frame myself up front. Deepa,
it takes a lot of boldness, to step into that space of saying who you are as a coach. And I really like it because the client has as much of a right to know where you're coming from, because they're selecting you just as they're assessing whether it's a good fit, just as you are doing that. And leaders really are the stewards for our organizations and also our societies. So if we close our eyes to the larger environment and they close their eyes to the larger environment, there's something really wrong with that picture. Then we are really assuming that we are functioning as isolated bubbles and not as part of a larger whole, which is one of my fundamental beliefs, that we are not individuals and isolated at all, that we are very much interdependent on each other and on the environment around us, if sometimes tangibly and to a large extent intangibly. How the forces of what is happening out there impacts me, whether I know it or not. So I think keeping that front and center in terms of who you are and what your relationship with the environment is, and allowing the client to sense that and feel that is a really critical part of the initial relationship building for me as a coach.
So having the opportunity to state up front who you are in the JEDI space, that is critically important, and then building around that. Thank you so much. So in the wake of Black Lives Matter and other watershed moments, we see companies that are anxious to make positive change. In some incidences, they have recruited coaches of color to diversify their pool of coaches. However, the design of the selection process, whether it may be intentional or not, is primarily done through chemistry sessions, where clients will meet a few coaches to decide, who they want to work with. And so human nature tend to have like match like. So consequently, if most of the people being coached in the corporate setting aren't people of color, I don't know what the likelihood that the coach will be matched to that. So concerning the coaching and structural racism, this really perpetuates a cycle of exclusion and drastically impacts the earning potential of coaches of color. So the question that I'm presenting to you here is, what are the barriers to entry for coaches of color within the industry, and how can they be converted to opportunities?
Deepa, I'm going to let you go first on that.
Yeah. There's many elements of diversity in addition to color. So I'm just going to expand the field a little bit, Deborah. There's color, there's language, there's dress, there's food, there's, exposure to in early childhood. I mean, you name it, and there's differences. How can, there are certainly challenges, because whenever you experience something that is different than you, there's resistance. And it's that phenomenon of, if there's not homogeneity, there's separation. It's so automatic in our minds. And honestly, I am part and parcel of it. It's the narrative of our universe, almost, you can say. So what is the opportunity here? The opportunity, of course, is at a very broad level, that of expansion. To expand your beliefs, your assumptions, your ideas, yourself, that you embrace more and more and more. And I think the other piece that is an opportunity, again, is to learn a little bit about yourself. Underlying any separation is fear. You separate yourself because you're afraid. So here you are, you yourself are experiencing it. Well, everybody around you is also experiencing the same. So it's really a collective phenomenon. And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity. It's hard to separate the two. At a very existential level, I see how what I'm facing is also what my clients are facing. And to come from a place of, sometimes I don't have all the answers, but I can be curious and I can be aware. I think that is really my mantra, to be curious and to know that I don't have all the answers. That opens up possibilities for meeting the challenges, which are often resistances by way of what I meet in my clients or in my, as barriers to entry into the profession. Just the differences create fear. You're a stranger. Some of the other practical things I have found to be very helpful are sharing more about myself. So speaking, taking the initiative to introduce myself and say more about myself, making myself more visible, doing presentations, or, where you are really an advocate for yourself. That really has, at an individual level, been an approach that has worked for me. So I'll stop there. And Carrie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I really like, Deborah, how you framed it, that like tends to attract like. And if you are a coach of color, primarily those who are seeking coaches could be those in privileged positions and maybe seeking someone who's like them. And you are uncovering a system that's unjust, and that system dynamic needs to be named. And so what comes to mind for me is what conversations are happening with those inside an organization who are selecting coaches to be part of the panel. What conversations are happening amongst those eligible for coaching inside the organization on what it means to have a chemistry call. A chemistry call does not mean I'm going to select someone who I think is most like me, who I can be most comfortable with. The chemistry call is, do I feel psychologically safe with this person, and will this person help me grow? And back to Deepa's point, the person could be best suited for me would be someone who's different than me. But our organizations having those conversations with their internal clients who are eligible, are they providing that larger landscape? My gut says probably not. Therefore, if we're going to be invited into an organization to be part of the bench, how are we influencing how they represent the matchmaking process so that that dynamic is named, which would hopefully provide more opportunity for people to really select someone so different than them. And it's within that difference that we can experience growth. That's probably a short answer for a very long, challenging process. But I guess the question for all of the coaches listening in or on this live call of what conversations have you been part of like that, if any? And if you've not, what would that mean for you to begin to influence how organizations use coaches?
Carrie talked about having a conversation in a larger landscape, which brings me back to what I said earlier, like watershed moments, like the murder of George Floyd has really caused a proliferation of the usage and the acknowledgement of the term DE&I-J, right? And it's really have talked about the consciousness of action and what we need to do. So we see these terms as social change and social justice. But really, when you think about it, some of these terms are used by certain kind of context or certain kinds of groups. But so my concern as a coach and someone who's committed to social change is coaching for social change is now viewed in the marketplace as a commodity by some folks, which I think is neutralizing the power and the impact of social change. And for our conversation today, in a wider context, coaching for social change, I want to say it's migrated into coaching for social justice because we are talking about justice. However, I want to just take it back a little bit, and I just want to acknowledge the spirit and the source from which the social change era came from. And I want to pay tribute to Hani Shokri, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who was an Egyptian coach who coined the to my, and correct me if I'm wrong, he was really the first practitioner to use the term. So therefore, given that we are aware of such appropriation of the term, how can coaches who are actively committed to social change and social justice, protected from assimilation or appropriation or monetization?
And Deborah, just so it might have just been me, you froze up a little bit. This Egyptian
Oh,
coach, he coined the phrase social change, or was it social justice?
social change.
Social change. Okay.
Okay.
Wow, you're asking such great questions. Deepa, would you like to go first on this one too?
Yeah, I didn't quite get the question, Deborah. In terms of
Sure.
appropriation, yes, I get that. But with the specific question of us,
Yes, how can coaches who are actively committed to social change or social justice, protected from assimilation or appropriation or monetization?
mm, yeah, yeah, it's tough, but I think again, at an individual coach level, what comes to mind is the term authenticity. And when we work with organizations, I think organizations can get sucked into this as well, and it often happens, which is why I think, Kerry and I, and as well as you, Deborah, in terms of your questions, it's really emphasizing that it's important to have certain values in place before you engage in any kind of change. And coaching is very much a modality that engages with change. So my sort of one word answer is awareness of values, both at the organizational, group, or individual level, and naming them, being clear about them, having clarity, and being authentic, walking your talk. So that's where I take this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I am leery. The more I learn, the less I know. And I'm leery of those who pose as expert coaches in certain topics, or who really push certain agendas as coaches. And I think we have to come back to, who are we there to serve? And again, we can't take our clients somewhere we haven't gone ourselves. And so we have to do our own work. The Black Lives Matter movement, we've got to do our own work around making sense of that. How did this movement even surface? What was behind? What was going on in the system at the time? What has it led to? What resistance did it face? Do we understand historically what's gone on in that space? And that's just one aspect of social unjust issues. I would never pose as an expert in anything I just mentioned. What I can pose as, I am ready to serve and coach amongst these conversations, because it's through conversations that we're going to have shifts in awareness. Probably not through a training, probably not through a tutorial or anything online. We have to do our own work. And how are we inviting our clients to do our own work, their own work? And so I agree with you, Deborah. I think there probably does need to be some collective morality around how are we as coaches positioning our services. And I don't have any examples that I've seen recently that would make me pause and scratch my head, but I do think when it comes to ethical coaching practice, we have to be really clear on what it is we are doing and how we are serving our clients. And I think it goes back to Deepa's thing too. We have to be clear on our own assumptions, beliefs, and values.
Thank you. Well stated. So in terms of BIPOC coaches, there is research out there that their approaches to the coaching process differs from that of the white counterparts. It also shows that they are engaged in the process of deconstructing, inherent whiteness and colonialism they experience in coach training programs and other interventions, just being educated in the system. They also ascribe different meanings to approaches, theories, and strategies. So these coach training can feel alienating for many BIPOC individuals in the program. So you're both educators. So what are some universal barriers for students of color that you as educators have noticed? And the second part to that question is, how can you better support them?
Yeah, I love that this question is coming up, and I think as a program director of a coach training program, it's a conversation that I need to be in regularly, weekly. We need to decolonize our thinking, but I can't decolonize my thinking by myself. I have to be with others. And so when we bring students in at fielding, I can only speak to fielding, we are learning alongside our learners. Faculty are not sages in front of the room on stage presenting a curriculum that we believe is universal. We are presenting theoretical underpinnings, and we're presenting the International Core Coaching Federation's core competencies. And we are facilitating the learning conversation in every cohort that I have experienced so far, Deborah. Someone will raise that issue of this doesn't work for my culture, or I'm not sure how to make sense of this based on my upbringing, my sense of it. And it is there we hang. We hang in that conversation and we learn from each other. And I think there is hundreds of ways to be an amazing coach. There are some single ways we can be bad coaches, but there are so many different ways we can adopt coaching mindsets that are not homogenous, that are not showing fidelity to just one way of knowing. And that's one of the things I'm proud of at Fielding is we invite different ways of knowing. In that invitation, though, we have to be open to learning. As faculty, as fellow learners and students, we can't just hear it. We need to absorb it. And sometimes that happens over time, but we've got to create space for those conversations to surface so that every learner feels included, even when they don't feel included and they raise their hand and say, this doesn't work for me. I love it actually when that gets raised, because it's a moment for us to pause and figure out what is it that is coming across as too tunneled or too specific that would not create a just system for all coaches. And we have so much work to still do. I mean, no one is doing this perfectly. No coach training program has this cornered. It's our willingness to learn. I think that's going to help create space. Deepa.
I love it. And I think what is also coming through is that it's an evolving thing. It's an emergent phenomenon. There's no fixed answers or solutions here. It truly is emergent because culturally we are just changing so much as a global society. That's one piece of it. And I think the other piece, what you said, I want to reiterate is that we can't be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And it's those mistakes that are really our opportunities to learn. And the third thing that came up for me as I was listening to Carrie was that we cannot learn without diversity around us, without differences around us. We as faculty experientially will learn nothing, because the theoretical learning is no learning at all. It's the embodied learning that is important for us as coaches. And how does that happen? That can only happen when we bump against differences, when we have conflicts, when we make mistakes, when we fall down and bruise ourselves. So that's what was coming up for me as I was listening to you, Carrie. It's very, very poignant, actually. It's also very poignant how we, like you said, are not experts. We are walking the journey along with our students. And the learning for us is as much as it is for our students. And that makes it so rich and so emergent.
So along those same lines, in terms of support, how can you draw more students of color to your program?
Having panel discussions like this. That's certainly a start. I think just again, I keep coming back to walking our talk. If in the information sessions we have, if in the webinars we have, we are sort of sharing our vulnerability as whether it's the group is fielding or whether it's the faculty, whatever the group may be, the homogeneous group may be, just to sort of manifest our openness and willingness to differences. And at a larger scale, I think it's our program that speaks. I think it's Fielding's vision that speaks. I mean, this university was, and Carrie, please, you have more words to share this, but I was drawn to Fielding because its vision was social justice. And that means something. So at a larger scale, that's what attracted me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you're asking a question, Deborah, that every coach training program needs to wrestle with, of how do we attract learners who maybe have not had access in the past. How do they have access to coach training? And that is a bigger system conversation. And I ask myself that a lot, but I think it comes down to a few fundamental things. And I agree with what Deepa said. Speaking of Fielding specifically, Fielding was born in a certain way as a university. We were born to be blended. We were born to be distributed. We were born with a social justice identity. And how we continue to expand on that is attractive to many people, and attracts diversity from that identity alone. But I think it's also our alumni. It is those who've gone through the program who maybe have a different lens on their own assumptions, beliefs, and values, who are engaging in conversations with a JEDI focus that can attract even their clients to consider, what could Fielding offer me? Our faculty are so instrumental in that. Our learners want to be learning beside faculty who represent. And so all of those are important. I think it comes down to Fielding being willing to constantly adjust our curriculum. fielding being willing to constantly change and grow. We are not part of a large university system that makes change hard. We adjust all the time. And so for coach training to attract the right learners, there's got to be that agility and that adaptability, and looking at access, looking at cost, looking at, what's associated for our adult learners to be part of this. Like, all of this is part of a bigger conversation. But our learners need to walk away feeling like they got what they came for. And if we are hesitant or timid on having the hard conversations around JEDI and what is just, what is not just, how are we responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, how are we responding to what's happening in our political environment, then we're in a bubble that doesn't represent the work that needs to be done. And I think, Deepa, going back to something you said earlier, we have got to be engaged in these hard conversations. If we can't hang in those hard spaces as coaches, then we may not be serving our clients as well as we could when we're out in the world coaching.
Is it okay? Because I want to go back to something that you said, Carrie, and also what you said, Deepa. You talked about looking at your values and your beliefs and remaining curious and aware of your own, inner work. And Carrie, you talked about stating up front, in terms of who you are as a coach, and embedding that into the dialogue, as you're coaching. So I want to ask the question, what are some other approaches for coaches in addressing JEDI conversations?
Do your own work. I mean, it really does come to, and I wish I could say, oh, I started this work 20 years ago and I just keep growing and adding, and that's not true. I mean, I really started my own work about 7 years ago, and I read material, and I was in conversations, and I was in book club, and The Warmth of Other Suns and Tahiti Coates' work, The World Between You and Me. And I look at the pedagogy of the oppressed, like, how are we doing our own work? As we integrate that, how you want to use it will emerge. It will be your way. I don't know if I'm answering the question though, Deborah. Like, there's not one way, but how are you taking in information? How are you learning and being steeped in this? And as you do that, things are going to shift in you, and it's going to provide opportunities for you to share your learning with your clients. You'll be known for that coach who's interested in certain types of things, and then you'll influence other coaches to do similar type work. But Deepa, what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely, completely with you. And also, it's interesting, but the whole field of diversity and inclusion has become so big in organizations and in our society right now. This whole topic has taken on increasing importance and significance. And a lot of the argument around having these conversations at a organizational level has focused on if we have diversity, we are more effective. That's or at least that's one of the reasons why organizations are wanting to have diversity. And this is where research has taken it a step further and pointed out that unless you create a context of justice and equity, there's going to be diversity and inclusion mean nothing unless you reconfigure power dynamics and how you are creating the culture of the organization so that everybody has a voice. diversity means nothing. So I think we as coaches are meeting an environment where this has become an important topic. So there's no getting away from it. You can close your eyes and focus on a more limited field, but I don't think you can get away from it anymore. So for me, the job then becomes to really begin to educate myself as to the realities of the context of the organization I'm working in. You know, what is that system about? And to what extent is my client being influenced by that system? That's another piece that very often we are just inferring, but if there are inferences, we can always check it out with our clients and with HR business partners in the organizations. So I think that starting the conversation is not difficult. It's sort of embedded in the context if we are coaching in organizations. And even outside, even with individual clients, I mean, this is not a conversation we can avoid anymore. I think that's where, that's my bottom line. So the more we can educate ourselves, the more we can be prepared, the more we can be aware when we don't have, you know, and none of us have answers, none of us, but we can ask questions.
I do have a follow-up question to that, but I just want to take a couple of seconds and just say we're going to be opening it up for questions in about 10 minutes or so. Just want to remind the audience that if you do have questions, please type it into the chat function area and please send it to everyone. So Deepa, you really talked about having the understanding from the perspective of having a conversation in the organization, because diversity on its own doesn't mean anything. And so being really ready and willing and authentic and about the intention of having a diverse and inclusive organization. So I want to expand on that and I want to ask the question. So what do you think the global community need to do in addressing these very important issues of JEDI?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I'd love to hear what, you know, our attendees also have to say about this, because we are all the global community right here who are interested in this topic. Simple things come to mind around openness, curiosity, which we've talked about before. And inculcating that as a global community is a different question, but I think it can be done. And there's quite a lot of conversations happening around that also in other kinds of forums, you know, around collective understandings, collective trauma, collective consciousness. All kinds of conversations are happening, which are bringing the global community, diverse communities, because the global communities are just about as diverse as it can get, together in a single forum, listening to the same narratives or conversations or same questions. I think that's all I have for now, but if something else comes up later, I'll say more. So let me stop here.
Carrie, would you like to add?
Yeah, and my head went in so many different places. So Deborah, ask the question one more time.
Oh, I said, what does the global community need to do in terms of addressing JEDI?
And when you say global community, you're talking the global community of coaches.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think we have to provide more of this. We have to provide more spaces for conversation. I think we need to provide more time to learn from each other. I need to sit with someone and say, what do you think? What's your perspective around this? The best way for me, I'll speak for myself, the best way for me to learn is for me to do some of my own work, reading, absorbing, but then talking about it. And we need to look at who is in our sphere, who's our first team of coaches. We all have our colleagues that we go to with stuff. When we want to bounce something off of, sort of our best coach friends. How are we forming those connections with others to stay in these conversations? And I would also recommend that people use supervision, coaching supervision within groups, to have conversations around JEDI and allow the supervision space to help someone reflect and explore on, I want to have a bigger footprint in this space. I want to have a bigger voice, or I want to have a bigger influence, or I want to create a different invitation. Those are spaces that these types of things can be explored, but I think we've got to be in conversation wherever those conversations. So the global community, I think we need to be asking ourselves, what conversations are we in?
Mhm.
Yeah, the other thing that's is
No,
that
go
I
ahead.
think it would be nice to have more interface with diverse communities of coaches.
Mhm.
And that does happen in the international coach federation, conferences that we've had in Europe and Asia and places like that. And I have found that extremely helpful in just expanding one's perspective. Unfortunately, the last 2 years have been sort of atypical, and all conferences have been online, but really it's a fantastic way of heightening that sense, or not only of the global community, but bringing attention to issues of justice.
And I'm going to even get even more specific since you brought that up. What do you think professional bodies, coaching bodies need to do?
I get nervous when they try to put together a list of competencies, or I get nervous when there's these bullet points of this is what it means to play in this. I get nervous. And so I don't know the answer to that question, Deborah, because it is such a complex system. And when we try to oversimplify it, we do the very opposite of what we're trying to create, which is space for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to exist. And so I get nervous when we try to package it or oversimplify it. I really think it comes back to what coach training programs are doing. And are we creating space for these conversations? If we can start it in coach training and create appetite for it, and almost like this, I need more, I need to keep learning, that to me is what will hopefully drive a greater movement than adding something to the International Coaching Federation or adding something, around ethics. It has to come from within somehow.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just seeing someone here before we move on from the chat box said that thank you for bringing this rich conversation to us. Feeling adjust all the time. We must be willing to adjust. So yes, it's so important to embed this belief in our practice with our clients. And for whatever reason, it's cutting me off. But that's really important what you're saying, Carrie and Deepa. And I just wanted to highlight that some themes that I'm hearing from both of you that's coming through is that it is really about doing your own work first. As liberation, like as coaches, we are liberating clients. And before we can liberate clients, we need to liberate ourselves. We really need to get internal and ask the hard questions to ourselves first before we can even begin to address them. So that really is the theme that I've been hearing today that is coming up. So start with self, and then, really be bold and courageous. It sounds like, this conversation is not an easy one to be had at all. And it can take people in very different places and dark stages. And so just to be bold enough to have that conversation. So I just want to take the time and just say, before I get to the last question, again, if you do have any questions, because we're going to open it up in about 1 minute, please go ahead and type them in the chat and type it to everyone. So of that, go broader than the professional bodies and that the global community of coaches. What do you think we as a society needs to do? And that's a big question, right? But I just wanted to just bring it outside of the realm of coaches.
And the question is, what can we as a society do to address social justice? Is that the question?
Yes.
Gosh, we are all plodding along, Deborah.
I'm looking at the chat, and Sherry, you're asking a great question, and I'm so eager to answer that. But I think Eliza is bringing up a really good point. Our artists, we really need to leverage artists more. Those in the film industry, those in music, those who are in theater. It is through those platforms society learns, because we're so attracted to entertainment. And so, when you think of movies like Selma and some other movies that have come out that have been so educational, to me, I think we need more of that. We need more courage in some of those platforms. We also need more leaders, more CEOs, more executive teams willing to do the awkward, uncomfortable, provocative stance. We need to see more of that. I think there's such great platforms out there that society does listen to and respond to. And so if you're on that platform, what can you be doing, and what more can you be adding?
Yeah. And I'm a great believer in experiential learning. So for me, what comes up is exposure to differences, travel, put yourself in groups that are different than you, go attend, concert that is hosted by an Iranian artist or an African artist, or whatever. It's just that exposure to differences that wakes you up.
Yeah.
Sherry said that she will be interested to hear your thoughts about experiencing resistance to anything JEDI from clients or students. What have you done in those moments?
So first of all, we've had resistance in every single cohort that I have been part of since I started as program director. It's inevitable. And we trust the process. We stay in the awkward, we stay in the uncomfortable. And one of the things we've begun doing, and we're doing it in a much more intentional way, is we're doing a lot of work around psychological safety. And we do that in the first 2 days of the program. What does it mean to be psychologically safe? We know there'll be ruptures at times around belief systems or between, as Deepa might say, we might bump up against each other. Let's talk about it now. How do we want to be? Because they will happen. They've happened every single time. And we say up front, you will be uncomfortable. We will be talking about social justice. We will be talking about race. We will be talking about intersectionality. We will be talking about things that make you uncomfortable. How do you want to be? Now, when it happens, we forget sometimes that we said we were going to be a certain way, but we hang in there. We hang in there through the 8 months, and people find their own way through it. You know, again, just like you can't coach someone who doesn't want to be coached, you can't educate someone who doesn't want to be educated. And we're not necessarily educators in those moments, we're facilitators. How do we facilitate the right conversations? How do we facilitate what feels like a rupture between the group members? How do we not run away from, but face it? We don't always do it well, and it gets messy. We don't necessarily invite that because it's so hard, but it happens every single cohort. And we've got to just get used to it, just as it's going to happen in society. It happens in families. It happens in any group. And I think my learning as a program director is creating psychological safety. If that exists, we can muddle through anything.
I love that you're bringing that example of what happens to us, literally and truly, how every cohort is a microcosm of an opportunity to practice JEDI, honestly. And not only for us as faculty, but for each one of the students. And I think, just the awareness that it is a microcosm of where we are practicing JEDI, seeing the resistance, hanging with it, as Carrie says. Sometimes it dissolves, and sometimes it doesn't. It stays there right to the end, and that's okay. So it's a tremendous learning field, and those same principles of hanging and noticing and having conversations that can be taken to the world at large, to your clients, to your, other students in other contexts. So, yeah.
We have a comment here from Christy. She said, I'm curious to know and ask what may be the obvious question. From whom, came up, okay. Okay. From whom is the bulk of the resistance coming from? I suspect among white folks. Feels like in this setting conference, we might need to call that in. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, not always though. Yes. And what's at the heart of resistance is my attachment to being right. My attachment to my own assumptions, beliefs, and values. And so one of the things we talk about in the program is, what if we yielded and released our righteousness to stay open? Existential guilt in the white community does nothing to serve this greater conversation. And so sometimes we have to call that out, but we've seen students of color experience conflict as well. So it's not always the white folks who are resisting. I think we all at times are going to be provoked. We all have to interrogate, why do I believe what I believe? And how attached am I to that belief system? And so we're all at times experiencing resistance. I would argue no student at Fielding comes in believing that they're fully baked, that they're all sorted. They're here to learn. And we attract that type of learner, we admit that type of learner. So that the resistance isn't necessarily, I don't want to understand Black Lives Matter. I don't want to understand, someone who's different than me. It's, I'm having a hard time releasing my own sense of righteousness. That's typically the core of some of the resistance we've experienced. And Deepa, what would you add to that?
That's absolutely correct. I would add that resistance comes from the dominant group, whatever that may be, in any context. If the males are dominating, it'll come from there. If the experts are dominating, it'll come from there. You know, as Carrie said, it's that feeling of righteousness. I don't want to let go of my privilege. And we found ourselves in that position. We are not outside of it. So
I'm so glad you brought that up, Deepa. Fielding does attract a lot of highly educated learners into the evidence-based coaching program. It's not unique for the majority of a cohort to hold a PhD. And so sometimes the dominant group are the highly educated. And, you know, Deepa, all the faculty are scholars as well. And so, you know, to invite someone into the not knowing, to invite someone in to release your way of being, to experience the unknown is very uncomfortable sometimes for scholars. That can show up as resistance as well. You know, this is hard. Coaching is messy, and getting educated as a coach is messy and hard. You have to do a lot of self-work, a lot of self-reflection in order to be fully present for a client. And we understand that it will at times challenge even the most open learner.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to say that we're a small group enough. So if you want to pop on screen and just absolutely join the conversation, please feel free to do that. We have about another 10 minutes or so to address any of your questions. So don't be shy, we welcome them. And I'm sure the panel members would love to have that conversation with you.
Carrie, I really liked how you mentioned psychological safety. That is just so important. It's something that's talked about more and more these days in organizational development type spaces. But those of us who have taken EBC or are fielding folks of one sort or another tend to understand its importance already. So it seems like people are catching up a little bit, but I think it's important not only to look at our workplaces and creating psychological safety, but also extending that to our research that we do as coaches, as OD practitioners, whatever kind of research that we do, but also in the coaching milieu, which I also think is just so important. So psychological safety is being talked about more. So it's something that also I think you can leverage. I'm finding that you can leverage even more now, but it's something that I think as fielding folks, it isn't a big aha, but it's certainly something that we can talk about more in different circles.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful around assuming a shared knowledge of the obvious as well, is that even though some people might have heard of psychological safety, you know, building a psychologically safe contract as a cohort, that's a body of work. You know, it's not something that you provide a list of, here's what it looks like. The group has to create it themselves. And even those who are familiar with it will find themselves challenged at times to say, again, how do I want to be when stuff emerges? And so creating space for that, I think, is really important. Thank you.
Yes, we have time for about 4 or 5 more questions. So please feel free to join the conversation. This is a silent group. Well, I'm going once.
Well, I saw some cameras come on, so that's sometimes evidence that someone might want to say something. I see Leah and Christy and Sherry, Augusta. What are you guys thinking?
I'll hop in. This having this conversation from this level is just as I was texting one of my classmates, so there's a couple of us new students in here, so it was awesome to see that, but just texting back and forth with a classmate to be like, oh whoa, just changing our thinking around DEI versus JEDI, and thinking about justice, and leading with that. I'm just sitting in that, and really I'm like, okay, how do I research more and think more about that? So I just appreciate from that aspect, that conversation early in the beginning on that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Plus, Leah, I think JEDI is so much cooler. I really do. And I think just waving your hand, there is no issues. Anyway, anyone else?
I have a struggle I'm sitting with, and I don't know how to bring it up. This is one of those where you're stepping into the vulnerable. DEI often becomes conversation around race, and yet it is much broader, right? There are other areas we just talk about. So, you know, what if I'm seeing myself an expert and I'm in the dominant group, that might be problematic. There's ability and disability and those kind of things. How do I stay kind of focused on issues and having conversations in the right place and around the right container without watering it down or seeming like I'm watering it down, and yet making sure I'm still recognizing that there is a broader, so like whole system and element of system, I think is, and I have no idea how to do it.
And Astrid, I'm so glad you asked that question. And that's why for me, it's about justice first. Is this a system that's just for all? Because we don't want to combine everything into one, and that dilutes everything. And that has been a challenge for organizations a lot. But it can sometimes feel like whack-a-mole, like, oh, this issue surfaced, so now we need to have initiatives around that. Oh, now this surfaced, we need to have initiatives around that. And I think it's boggling on how do I create space for all the different initiatives. But if I step back and say, what about this system is unjust? And how am I having conversations around what a just system looks like? A just system, as Deepa described, is everybody has a voice, everybody has a seat at the table, everybody has access to feel heard. That to me is the bigger conversation versus which one should my organization be paying attention to at any given time. Deepa, what do you think?
Yeah, what's arising for you? That's Astrid, anything arising based on Carrie's response?
I love it. To me, that's very helpful now, because I am going to like really look at it, because I was still thinking, does it really matter? The J, I heard what you said, it made sense, but it didn't go that level deeper. I feel now that is really helpful to come back around and say, why is it so important to have a JEDI conversation, starting with that J? Very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, yes. It's very hard to decide for anybody else, you know, what, or in an organizational setting to say, you know, these are my priorities. I think having that conversation and letting it emerge is probably the only way, whether it's an organization or a group or a group of students or whatever that may be.
We still have time here for more questions.
It's fun watching your faces because I can tell you guys are like processing the,
I
you
feel
know, what do
so-
I really think about what's been shared?
Yeah,
I mean, this is hard stuff. And Deepa and I are kind of like swimming in some dark waters, but we're swimming in it together, you know. The faculty at Fielding, one of the things I love about us, and Dr. D can attest to this, is we hang together. Like we are, you know, we're always coming together. What can we shift? What can we pivot? Where do we need to spend more time? Where do we need to focus more? And I'm really proud of what the faculty do. And I wish more organizations did the same. But I just saw Christy's hand go up, so I'll stop.
Don't want you to stop at all, Carrie. I just did want to add that if anyone's interested, on Thursday of this conference, myself and a few others on this call are leading what's referred to as a 3-practice circle and about decolonizing the curriculum. And, you know, it has application to what you all have been speaking about as well. So think about that on the Thursday schedule if you want to bring in your expertise and take your 2 minutes to share and allow people to ask clarifying questions, make space for people to ask clarifying questions and just get some dialogue moving about this. So welcome you there. And Carrie, you and I will see each other on Friday at Aloha Friday also.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I'm doing a presentation on Wednesday around silencing and what it means to have voice that can feel heard. Yeah, there's so much research that this community has engaged in, and how does that research then inform our work? Yeah.
Still have about another 2 or 3 more minutes to open it up. So please join in.
You know, I have one thing to say perhaps, which might be an interesting reflection for each one of you to take away. We talked a little bit about power dynamics. I used the word dominant group. And it's interesting to take stock of what dominant groups are you a part of? And what subordinate groups are you a part of? And how does it make you? What does it evoke in you, being a member of one versus the other? This might be an interesting question for you to reflect on, because all of us have memberships in both dominant groups and subordinate groups. I, as a parent, am a part of a dominant group. I, as a daughter, sometimes a wife, sometimes a sister, can be a part of a subordinate group. And you can extend that to the wider world.
I think that's an excellent question. I want to go to a question that's posted in the chat area from Erica. She asks, what do you think holds other institutions back from having these conversations?
A lack of expertise. But I think it's that we have to be experts. Like that thinking in and of itself is so faulty. Like we need experts to come help facilitate it, or we need, you know, to hire experts to facilitate it. I think the best thing an organization can do is just when leaders sit around and say, we've got some work to do, you know, where should we start, you know, and how do we share learning? There's such a vulnerability in entering into these conversations. And as coaches, we embrace vulnerability. We know how attractive vulnerability can be in our practice. Outside of coaching, people aren't paid to be vulnerable. They're paid to have answers, and they're paid to lead a certain way, and they're paid for their expertise. So when institutions are being invited into that place of vulnerability, and it's so contrary to all the success they've had up till now, I think they defer. They defer to HR. They defer to the diversity, equity, and inclusion department, or they create a department, or they hire someone else to be in charge. And you know, there's such a beauty in not knowing. But if we not know together, wisdom emerges. It really is a paradox. And I think, Erica, organizations have an allergy to stepping into that vulnerability.
Tracy, it felt like you had something to ask or share.
Well, yeah, actually there's multiple thoughts going on, because I think, to Carrie's point, like I've always, I am a certified coach, right? But there's this beauty of when we have group conversations, right? There's that old adage, you don't know what you don't know. But I take it further in that you also don't know what to ask. Because if you don't know what you don't know how to ask the question to gain that knowledge. And I think having conversations that spark those questions is what's needed. And then going back, Deepa, to what you said about the dominant and subdominant groups, there's also, I feel, added to the conversation, the invisible dominant and subdominant groups, right? The neurodiversity, whether it's anxiousness, whether it's Asperger. And I feel a lot of the conversations are in the external, like, oh, I can identify I'm part of this group and this group, but what about those internal, right? What about those mini traumas or those things that we're not, it needs to be just, and I just love putting the justice first, because that actually it's been that extra nugget that's helped me wrap some things that I was thinking about. So anyway, thank you. It was a great conversation.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Love the addition of the invisible. It's so true. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, we are at about 1 minute before we end. So if you have any final word or thoughts or question, please do so in about a minute. And then we can proceed with closing out. Wanted to be respectful of everyone's time. So any final words or thoughts? All right. Well, I just want to say thank you, guys. Our discussion really today centered on the role of the coach in JEDI conversation. And although the coaching industry, has really made some headway, it is really up to us to embrace this topic and to embed it in our hearts and souls and minds. And I appreciate all that you have brought into the conversation today, the honesty, the directness, the openness. We are left with some charge, what dominant group we're part of, what subdominant group we're part of. We are asked, right, to look at it from the justice container. So we are asked that we do our own work, because as coaches, we are liberating others. So we first have to liberate ourselves. So we have a charge, we have action steps. And by that, I want you to be encouraged and bold and courageous